So I'm going to talk a little bit about digital twins and the smart city. And I entitled this talk, Fanciful Fiction, Dystopian Nightmare, or Part of the Answer. And you can have a guess right at the start about which one of those it's going to be. And I'd just like to acknowledge, I'm talking about some of the work that we've been doing in Newcastle and other cities in the UK. I really believe is sort of trying to lay some of the foundations around digital twins within the urban context, but also perhaps also a note of caution about how far we can push it and whether we want to push it, and some of the issues that these types of systems might raise. So no doubt many of you have come across the term digital twin, and the issue with digital twins is that for every time you look, there's a new definition of them and a slightly nuanced version of what a digital twin is. And here's my version. A digital twin is an in silico representation of the real world. So in a computer, we build a model of the real world, but it's not purely a visual representation. So it's not simply a 3D model, and many people assume a digital twin is simply a 3D model. It's only really a digital twin, in my view, is when we take something from the physical space and bring it into the computer space, and then also from the computer space feed back into the physical space. So there's this feedback mechanism within the system that's critical to a digital twin. My definition of it means it incorporates real-time inputs, and that's a lot of the work that we've been doing in Newcastle about real-time data from the city systems and how we manage that data. For many people, when you talk about digital twins, it's this type of thing that they start thinking about. So this idea that somehow we can, with perfect knowledge, optimize our systems to literally within an inch of our lives and have these perfect clockwork cities that are somehow incredibly optimized and enormously efficient, and everything runs smoothly all of the time. But I imagine all of us, we live in cities. Even if we don't live in cities, we visit them. And cities are really annoying because they have these actors in them called citizens, and they don't behave in a normal way. The monkey brain within them does things in weird stuff. So the idea that we can optimize to this sort of clockwork twin is largely complete nonsense. I had a quick look around some of the definitions of smart cities, and this is typical of them. This is, I can't quite remember which website I pinched this one off, but it doesn't really matter. They're all very much the same. Here it says the point of a smart city is to improve operational efficiency. And in the second paragraph here, it says to promote economic growth, and optimize our systems. This is largely palpable nonsense. You cannot optimize messy places like cities. They are incredibly complex. They have people in them. We don't understand half of the stuff that goes on in cities, so we're never going to be optimizing them. It's an impossibility. I took some snapshots from our CCTV network, just essentially at random, just because our cities are incredibly inefficient places. But inefficient's good, because inefficiency also means redundancy. If you optimize within an inch of your life, you are essentially making a system that's really fragile, because any bit of it breaks and the whole thing breaks. Cities are incredibly resilient, as we've seen from earthquake response and natural disasters and other things. They bounce back, they're resilient. And part of why they're resilient is because they're inefficient. My view about how we build a digital twin, if you like, built on this type of data for cities, is thinking about how do we maximize the inefficiencies for good? So how do we be smartly inefficient? How do we use new forms of data to think about how can we improve things? How can we improve air quality, for instance, in the city, or our adaptation to climate change? How can we nudge behavior? And I think the new forms of data and machine learning and AI enables us to start to do things that was otherwise really hard, like optimizing lots of different trajectories. So we want to improve air quality today, but we also want to improve air quality over the year or a 5-year target. And at the same time, we want to nudge people's behavior into more sustainable transport, for instance. If we've got good data, we can start to think about how we might be able to nudge those behaviors in the right direction, keeping an eye on all these moving windows about the targets. So we can use inefficiency. The best way to get people out of their private cars is to make the roads unusable. If you have lots of traffic jams everywhere, the places with the best public transport systems do so because they've had terrible traffic problems in the past. And if you build inefficient systems that are really, really inefficient, alternatives at some point emerge. There might be some pain in there. But I do think there is something about how we use this data to be smartly inefficient, understanding that if we're too efficient, we're not very resilient. So what we've been doing in Newcastle and some other cities across the UK is thinking about, okay, what sort of data do we need to start building these digital twins of cities, whatever you think a digital twin is. So what we've been doing in Newcastle is investing in sensing technology and the infrastructure behind that to try and bring all of these sectors together of new forms of data enabled by the Internet of Things and this new paradigm of big infrastructure data. So data from our transport networks, data about the environment, data about how people move around the city. So we've invested quite a lot of money in infrastructure and sensing technology. And to date, we've got about 4,000 active sensor streams. So they are giving us about 10,000 observations every minute of every day of every hour. A sort of, if you like, that sort of living heartbeat of the city in data. All of that brought into one virtual space and is all available to anybody to access. So there's no restrictions on access to that data. So I'll give you some examples of the sorts of things that we've been collecting. Now, bear in mind, all of these are very visual because little grey boxes strapped to lampposts measuring things like temperature and noise are really dull to look at. So I've picked examples that are quite visual, but most of what we do is innocuous grey boxes on lampposts. But these are some more visual things that we collect. So things like air quality, understanding air quality, understanding traffic, understanding how we park our cars and where we do those through a variety of means. We've also done quite a lot of work around monitoring. Monitoring is the wrong word. I shouldn't use monitoring. I need to slap my wrists. I should never do that. Observing. We don't monitor. We observe. Monitor sounds like you're trying to find out some people have done something wrong. We're observing. So we observe pedestrian flows. We do pedestrian counting. We understand trajectories. We understand densities of people in and around the city centre to try and get a picture of how people move about the city. And most of that's done with a network of CCTV cameras in the city, most of which are edge processed. And I'll talk a little bit about this. I can already see some people slightly flinching when you start to show CCTV. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment because it's quite important. Some of the little grey boxes we have strapped to lampposts measure noise. So we have a network of 100 or so noise sensors across the city. Noise has a big impact on things like public health. And really what we're trying to do is garner all of this information across sectors and scales at the scale of the city to really understand how all of these different things interweave, and when you change one thing, how that has a knock-on effect and it ripples out over space, time, and sectors into other things. This is a particular type of noise pollution we measured a couple of years back. This was Ed Sheeran's concert at Newcastle St. James's Park on 3 consecutive nights. So the peaks there were his encore on those 3 nights. So we've been measuring an awful lot of data and collecting all of this data to try and get a real picture of how the city operates across scale and how all of these things are interdependent and woven together. And that's in the belief that if you want to tackle climate change, if you want to tackle net zero, if you want to tackle air quality, if you want to tackle inequality, you have to think holistically. You have to consider this whole city as a system. It's also that many of these problems have been categorized as what's known as a wicked problem. And a wicked problem has no simple solution. There's no magic bullets to climate adaptation or net zero. Somebody somewhere with all of these things, it's going to hurt them a bit. It's going to hurt them financially. It's going to hurt them economically. It's going to make their journey to work longer, whatever it is. And we need to understand that and understand the trade-offs about if we intervene in infrastructure or if we intervene through policy, how that is going to impact things, capturing not just success and failure, but also the unintended consequences of our intervention. This video, by the way, is Newcastle Quayside in a summer downpour a few years back, 3 or 4 years back. Most of the time people are sitting at restaurant tables. Normally it's about 12 degrees, to be fair, in Newcastle, and they're still sitting outside. We're hardy souls. But even Newcastle residents balked at this sort of thing. So what about the data? What about all of this data? Is data enough? There's this sort of underlying assumption that you measure things, you've got data, brilliant, you're done. And there's a few things, just a few points to raise that we might get into a discussion about at some point. The first one is context is everything. Data alone is just not enough. This is data from car parks or a number of car parks across the city. We monitor all of the car parks, so we know how many cars are in there and whatever. Interesting piece of data. And you can see there's some patterns there. And this was just a snapshot I did a week or so back off the website where our data is published. Point is, it looks interesting, but without context, without capturing context, which is really hard to capture, some of this data becomes meaningless. So the top one here is a car park on which we built an emergency COVID hospital in the UK called a Nightingale Hospital. And that was decommissioned. And you can see that a few weeks ago. And the car park reopened. That's what's happening. That's what's happening there. As you can see from a couple of these, the lockdown in the UK where retail shopping reopened again. You can see that with these city centre car parks. A couple of these are city centre car parks where the shoppers go. And the final one, this is the car park that's situated next to one of Newcastle's main hospitals. And as you can see, it's been pretty full all the way through. The point is, without that spatial, temporal, social and infrastructural context, the data is sort of meaningless. And capturing that's really very difficult and often overlooked. The other thing about thinking about these data is we already capture lots of data, but we tend to capture the easy stuff. And we need to really think about not just measuring the easy stuff. So people have been measuring traffic for years, 80, 90 years in the UK, which is why Newcastle and many cities has a you know, a motorway, an expressway running straight through the middle of its city, bisecting the city in half. So it's vital that we start to capture some of these really hard to measure things, like how do people use the city? How do they use the city? Where do they walk about? Not just measuring cars because it's easy, but measuring the things that matter. And of course, that raises real concerns, and there's huge concerns in the UK and Europe over this sort of surveillance society and all of that. But I think it's critical that we do capture it. We just have to do it in a privacy preserving way. So some of the work we've been doing is taking CCTV, turning them into these beautiful stick figures, and then removing the people from the image. So we've got all of the data we need to understand, but there's nothing there that is recognizable. And you can even go and delete. I love this one. They're holding hands. How gorgeous is that? There's nothing there that's identifiable in terms of privacy. So we can do it. We just have to think how we do it and do it properly. I'm just going to finish with an example of one of the ways I think that we should be using this data, whether you call it a digital twin or not, and how we should use this new type of data and why it's important, why it's valuable. This is an experiment, if you like, that we've been running with the City Council. This is the main east-west thoroughfare through Newcastle. It's called Blackett Street. And it's the main thoroughfare for buses. And it's been a long-term policy plan to pedestrianise it, to move the buses to other streets, turn it into a destination for pedestrians that's much nicer for them. So as part of that policy, we've been monitoring lots of things in and around that area to try and build that evidence for change so that we understand how this change might impact the city. So part of that experiment is we've been closing the streets and measuring the impact of it. But we've also got some data beforehand, so we have the baseline. It's important to capture that baseline to understand what's changed. So we have the baseline data. We then experiment by closing the street, and we can measure things like how much longer do people stay on the street? Are there more people there? Because presumably they then spend more money, and that's good for the city and the economy. We measure how long the buses take to carry on their routes. So closing the street, how much has that impacted bus journey times? And we measure things like the air quality that's improved and whether it's displaced, because of course, if you move buses, then those diesel polluting engines move elsewhere. So the air quality is going to get better, but where do we displace the problem to? So it's important to measure other places, not just where you're experimenting. I think what's really interesting is it's not surprising. None of the results that we got are groundbreaking or surprising. Guess what? If you make somewhere a nicer place for people to be without traffic, you get more people there and they stay for longer. The dwell times are longer. If the buses have to do a slightly more complex route, it takes them a little bit longer. If you take buses off a street, then the air quality improves a little bit. And it gets slightly worse somewhere else. In fact, because they use multiple routes, it was only a little increase in a couple of other streets. So nothing surprising, absolutely nothing surprising there. However, what was really good, what was interesting was that actually having a number, having data that the city leaders could take back as an argument to everyone who said, if you do this, it's going to be really slow on our buses. Our bus journeys are going to be much longer. It's going to be terrible for the economy because less people will want to go because they have to walk further, etc., etc. What this sort of data potentially gives people is it gives them numbers, it gives them evidence. So now we can tell you that, yes, if you do this, your bus journey will get longer. It'll get longer on average by about 20 seconds. And the air quality is going to be improved by so much. And the we're going to have more people there. There's going to be a 15% rise in people in and around that street, which should be good for business. And that's, I think, the power of this data, not startling results, but it gives people that evidence. It gives decision makers the evidence to stand up to all of those who say all change is bad, which is often the default position in whenever we try and introduce change into these very complex systems that we call cities. So I'm 25 seconds over, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Virtual applause from everyone. I did ask people, oh, I love all the applauses. Thank you. That's awesome. So it was a great, great presentation. We have one question from Fernando, and Fernando says, have you thought about using these data to calibrate some sort of agent-based model to simulate the impact of the interventions? This might be particularly important for cases where experiments are not really possible.
So that is exactly the title of one of my PhD students' thesis. So very prescient of you, Fernando. Exactly that. So how do we use these things to both calibrate? I think some of this data, whether it's an agent-based model or a digital twin, I think the data that we collect, this type of data, and I think one of the other points is that any city can do this. More than half our data now is not sensors that we've deployed. It's sensors that are already there. All we do is either have had agreements to get that data, or it's already in the public domain. So we just make it easier for everyone else to get it. So, you know, you don't need a huge capital investment to start to build these things. The data, or a lot of the data, is already there. But this data is really useful, I think, for being able to parameterize these sorts of twins, these sorts of models, and critically to validate them afterwards. Otherwise, how do you know whether your impacts had your interventions had the right effect if you're not measuring those impacts in the city, in the real world?
So Philip, this might be really in the weeds, but for someone who definitely wants to kind of do some of the implementation in cities in the US, you mentioned that you have agreements. So is it an agreement between the university and then some private entities?
Normally we just go in, well, initially we just started to ask, and then the other thing we did is we hoovered up everything in the public domain. And then what was really interesting is people started coming to us and saying, we think we've got, so the bus data I was talking about there came directly from one of the bus companies who has GPS on all of their buses, so they know where they are. They have no idea what to do with that data. So it was like, we've got all of this data. This data might be useful, and you know, and it is. It's incredibly useful because buses are a continuously running experiment on how good your city is at moving people around, because they run all the time, 24 hours a day. So actually, it's been about. Initially, there was a little bit of, you know, we had to badger a few people, but once it got to a certain size, we now have companies coming to us and saying, would you like our data? We've really no idea what to do with it, and we'd like it to be out there so that people can start to look at it and use it.
We have another question from Sheila, and Sheila asks, can multi-criteria decision analysis be used to support the optimization efforts for cities? Can we find the best option in terms of environment, society, and the economy using this method? It's a good question, Sheila.
I think you could find, I mean, the problem is best for whom? Is you know,
yeah,
best
fair.
for which sector? I mean, it's so complex. My gut instinct is to say no, it's too complex. I don't think there is an optimal solution to any of them. I think there's lots of messy trade-offs that will be constantly changing, and that's why having and being able to look at lots of real-time data is critical, because you know you're not going to have a plan and go, oh, here's an optimal solution, let's implement it, and 10 years down the line we're going to get it. Yeah. Because you know it's politics, it's people, it's society, it's all of those things. It's going to be a whole bunch of messy. You know, it's like a drunken man staggering down the street. He'll get there eventually, but in the meantime, he's going to bounce off a few dustbins and all the rest of it, and eventually he'll get to the end of the street and arrive at his location. That's how we move forward in cities, and it's really capturing that. And if you can't tell success from failure, then that drunken man, to stretch the analogy to breaking point, is going to be wandering backwards. You've got to be able to capture success and failure, and also those unintended consequences. I think that's where the data comes in. They're the sorts of things. That's how we move forward.
So Philip, Hua had actually a really similar question that I had, and it was, how do you even think about integration, right? Like, and I think you started to get to that when you started to mention context, right? It's one thing to have, okay, this is the air quality index, or this is the amount of noise. But when you look at things like, well, for example, this was the Ed Sheeran concert, or this was when, we came out of quarantine. Like, how do you actually start to track all of that data to then get context?
Well, I wish I had the answer to it. If anyone wants to put those up, there is metadata, but I don't think metadata sufficiently captures context. We're exploring it, and it's a really interesting question about how you bring the context along with the data. And I think there's a few tentative steps that you can start to do because of things like semi-structured data in databases. We don't just have to have a rigid table structure with an observation. We can attach other things to it and link data and things like that. There's some technical solutions to it, but I'd be lying if I said I knew what the answer was, because I really don't.
Well, Philip, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, and Oliver, thank you so much for making this great connection. And so again, virtual round of applause. Our next presenter is Dr. Dai. Is Dr. Dai here? Just want to make sure.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much. So she is an energy systems analyst at Argonne National Laboratory, and she leads life cycle analyses and techno-economic analyses in the ReCell Center at Argonne. And so we're really, really excited to have Dr. Dai with us, and she's going to be talking about sustainable batteries. So can you share your screen now?
Yes. Can see my screen?
Yes, again, and beautiful slides. I love these really colorful slides. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks a lot for having me. So hello everyone, my name is Chang, and today I'm very happy to share with you my research on how we can make batteries more sustainable. So first, I would like to answer the question why I am talking about batteries in the session about sustainable urban systems. I would like to think that electric vehicles are critical to sustainable urban systems. And according to the projection by the International Energy Agency, we're going to have an increase of 27 to 50-fold of the global electric vehicle stock by 2030. And also, according to the IEA analysis, using electric vehicles can help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the vehicle use phase. However, if we look at the vehicle cycle, shown here by the green bars and blue bars, we can see that, I'm sorry, maybe I should use a pointer. So we can see that if we compare battery electric vehicles to internal combustion engine vehicles, we are actually having higher greenhouse gas emissions from the vehicle cycle. And most of that emissions are coming from batteries. So in order to understand how we can maybe reduce actually where these emissions come from and how we can reduce them, at Argonne, we developed several tools. The first one is the grid model. With this model, we are able to evaluate environmental impacts of different fuel production pathways and different vehicle powertrain technologies. And also the environmental impacts of different materials production. And we have also developed a model specific for batteries called Everbat. With this model, we are able to evaluate the cost and environmental impacts of closed loop recycling of batteries. So in today's presentation, I will primarily talk about the analysis we did with life cycle analysis. So I'm pretty sure you are very familiar with this concept, so I will skip the slide. So how did we apply LCA to lithium-ion batteries in an electric vehicle? First, we need to find out what is in an electric vehicle battery. So the ratios shown here will change depending on what batteries we're talking about, specifically what cathode chemistry the battery is based on and what applications the battery is used for. But the overall material categories will be the same. So in a lithium-ion battery, we will have mostly active cathode material, anode material, the electrolyte, and some considerable amounts of aluminum and copper to be used as current collectors. So this is the material composition of an EV battery. However, if we want to know what it takes to produce a battery, it's a slightly different story. This Sankey diagram shows the process energy requirement to produce 1 kilowatt hour of battery. From the left to the right, we have upstream material production, and these are materials in the cathode powder. And in the middle, we have different materials in the battery. And in the right bottom corner, we have energy requirement for cell production. So from this graph, we can see that cell production is a very energy intensive step because of the electrode drying process and the operation of the dry room. Another major energy consumer we can identify from this chart is the production of the cathode material, including the production of the upstream materials and the production steps for the cathode powder itself. So once we know all this information and put that into our GRID or Everbat model, we will be able to evaluate the environmental impacts for battery production. So from this chart, we can see that as identified earlier, the active cathode material shown in blue and the process energy used for cell production shown in green are the notable contributor to the environmental impacts for lithium-ion battery production. And if we take a closer look at the cathode powder itself and try to see what are the contributors of the emissions and energy consumptions, we can see that, again, the energy consumption used for the production of the cathode powder itself and the upstream materials, especially the materials containing nickel and cobalt, are the notable drivers. So once we know the major contributors, how can we reduce the environmental impacts of battery production? The first obvious answer is using renewable energy for cell production. So the baseline results I have shown you earlier are assuming we're using electricity from the US national grid for battery production. If we are able to use renewable energy for cell production instead, we will be able to reduce the overall greenhouse gas emissions by over 20%. Since we've also identified cathode production as a notable driver, another opportunity we may have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions or other environmental impacts for battery production is through closed loop recycling. So this chart shows the different life cycle stages of a battery. And these green circles represent different closed loop recycling technologies. So by closed loop recycling, we are talking about recovering materials from spent batteries and incorporate these materials back to the supply chain of batteries and use them for new battery production. So the pyro recycling technology and hydro recycling technology, they are already commercialized. And with these recycling technologies, we will be able to recover nickel and cobalt and maybe also lithium from spent batteries. But we will be able to recover these materials as the different nickel, cobalt, and lithium salts. And we still need to use these materials to produce the cathode powder and then to produce the new battery. In contrast, at Argonne, we are trying to commercialize the direct recycling technology. As opposed to these commercialized recycling technology, we're trying to recover the cathode material as is. So we will be able to recover the cathode material and after some regeneration step, reuse that for new battery manufacturing. So as you can see, with different recycling technologies, we may be able to avoid different upstream steps along the battery supply chain. And if we try to evaluate the benefits of battery recycling, we can see that all battery recycling will help us reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with battery production. Basically, because if we compare spent batteries with nickel, cobalt ores or lithium brine, we're having higher concentrations of these materials in spent batteries than ores. So we are able to use less energy and reagents to recover these materials from spent batteries. And therefore, we will be able to emit less emissions and use less energy. And also, if we compare direct recycling technology with pyro and hydro, because we are able to avoid the very energy-intensive cathode powder production step, we are able to reduce even more emissions with this new technology. In addition to environmental impacts, battery production also face supply chain challenges. So we did some quick analysis trying to understand with current reserve how many car batteries we can potentially produce. As you can see, there is very little cobalt, nickel, and lithium in the US. And even if we're looking at the global scale and we exhaust all of the identified cobalt, nickel, and lithium for lithium-ion battery production, we will not have enough materials. So again, we hope battery recycling or a circular economy can help us solve this problem. We did an analysis with Leiden University in the Netherlands, and we find that currently, since most of the electric vehicles are still on the road, and in the near future, we won't be able to have many spent batteries to work with. So we're not going to see a huge portion of the material demand of lithium, cobalt, or nickel coming from recycling. However, if we look at the next 2 decades or so, as the volume of spent batteries continue to increase and as the production of new batteries starts to level off, we are hopeful that a significant portion of the new material demand for battery production will be met by materials recycled from recycling. So that's analysis we did with conventional life cycle analysis approach. But if we're trying to look into the future, we are facing some challenges. So specifically for batteries, if we're trying to imagine beyond lithium-ion batteries, especially if we look at the circular economy, and as we can see from this graph, how we can use recycled materials for new battery production with the consideration of new technology advancements, we will be have some challenges regarding first from the supply chain in the near future, from what material we're going to use for battery production, and from which region in the world is the material going to come from, and also from what source that battery material is going to come from. So the dynamic characteristic of the supply chain, and also the potential technology advancements will pose some challenges to our currently static methodology of life cycle analysis. So to quickly sum up, we have identified that the active cathode material and the energy consumption used for cell production are notable contributors to the environmental impacts of batteries. So we can either use renewable energy to power the cell production plant, which actually some of the battery manufacturers are also trying to explore the opportunity. We're very happy to see that. Or we can try to recycle batteries and reuse the materials for new battery production that can help us reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from battery production, and also can also help us secure material supply and also work towards a circular economy. As I mentioned, the dynamic supply chain and also potential technology advancements can pose some challenges for us if we're using conventional analysis to conduct the LCA or techno-economic analysis. So if we're trying to look forward and think of some future research areas, we can, I think one important question we need to answer is how to best evaluate the circular economy. For example, what metrics we can use. In my presentation, I have talked about the reduction for battery production or reduction achieved through recycling. But as you can see from this chart, recycling is only a small piece of the circular economy. If we're trying to capture all the benefits of the rest stages of the circular economy, especially if we're trying to consider the benefits of upcycling, downcycling, and energy recovery, we may need to think about metrics that can better summarize the benefits of the circular economy. Also, we may need to think about dynamic modeling, again, to account for the supply chain changes and technology changes. Another thing we may need to think about is the time horizon of the analysis. So normally when we do life cycle analysis, we look at one life cycle. But if we take battery as the example, some of the materials in the battery can be recycled indefinitely, allegedly, and other materials can be recycled for only a certain amount of times. So to account for these different numbers of times the materials can be recycled, maybe we need to define a time horizon for the analysis of the circular economy. And the last area is that the traditional analysis normally focus on a technology or a product, but in the circular economy, again, to account for all the benefits of these green boxes, perhaps a material-oriented approach would be more appropriate. And while we are at that, perhaps we can also consider material quality in the analysis. Okay,
thank you so much.
My time is up. And
this was
okay, thanks for that.
Yeah,
That's
this was a wonderful presentation, and it was so robust, and there were so many different pieces to consider. And you have really excellent questions for you in the chat, but we went over a little bit, so maybe you could answer them in the chat a little bit if you don't mind. And I have thank you so much. I have the absolute pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who I recently got to know. She's fabulous. And her name is Dr. Kang Tong. You may know her as KK. And she's a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton. And she's going to be talking to us about multi-scale urban energy analytics for low carbon and equitable development. And if I'm correct, I think this paper was just published. Is that right, KK?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I was looking at it last week. It's a great paper. So please join me in welcoming KK.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, for the introduction. And that actually helps me save 1 minute for my introduction slide, because today I'm talking about this paper. I was thinking about also sharing my research on carbon analysis from city to national level. But when I prepared the slides, I realized this paper really have a lot of content. So I was like, whatever, I just talk about this one paper. And this work, I worked with Professor Anu Ramaswamy. Some of you may know her. And we began the work almost 3 years ago when both of us were at the University of Minnesota. And we collaborate with two scholars from Florida State University and also two utilities, because we collaborate with them, get the data. So jump into, and also it is funded by two National Science Foundation grants. And now I'm going to jump into the study, begin with why we're looking at equitable low carbon transition in cities. It is really driven by cities' policy demand, because I've been working, and because the cities have been working on low carbon issues for like almost 2 decades now. Some cities even begin earlier than 2005. This is the US as example, but some cities in Europe also works on low carbon development quite early as well to address climate issue. And more, when people look at carbon actions, cities actually also realize there's not only about climate change issues, there's also a lot of social inequality issues. And then they trying to think about, when they taking carbon actions, whether they can also addressing those social inequality problems in cities. So the cities actually in the process that they are really seeking for a low carbon and equitable transition. And the cities need to understand the difference between understand the differences in energy use services, considering both income and racial impacts. And here I'm highlighting race because in the US context, I think that has been talked a lot recently. But in cities in other countries, there may be different stratification criteria that you can use, not only like race impact. So just like get you know, the method here is actually can apply to some other context as well. And in addition, and then cities are seeking actually method and metrics to track the equitable allocation of resources when they trying to, when cities taking actions, allocating funds, they have to understand how to track the resources is allocated and whether that is equitable, but they don't have clear ideas in terms of how to measure it, how to track it. Because cities actually face 4 main challenges in quantifying social inequality in energy use, to inform more equitable investment in investment in conservation, energy conservation and efficiency. And before I jump into the challenges, I would like to just get the definition of social inequality and social equity in energy use first, in energy sector first, because that's quite important. So here, when I'm talking about social inequality, is really a way to quantify the unequal distribution of various energy use parameters, either across the whole population that we use Gini coefficient to measure, or across different socioeconomic groups that we can calculate the disparity ratio that has been done in public health literature. And so the equal distribution here, what we're seeing is everybody have the same size of services, the same size of box as you're seeing in this picture. I think this picture has been used a lot, so I can't track where it is originally come from. And if you know, please let me know where it is originally come from. And so this tells you the extreme unequal distribution of kind of people have same size of box. But then social equity is actually evaluate the fairness in allocating resource among different groups to reduce social inequality, with a focus on reducing disparity for the most disadvantaged groups. So as you can see here, when we're talking about social equity, some people may need 2 boxes to get the chance to watch the game, right? Not everybody need a box. So the social equity is really trying to understand how the resource allocation close the gap and focusing on the most disadvantaged group. So this is the definition that I'm using. Some of you if working on energy justice or environmental justice, so you can see that this is from the distributional perspective. So in this analysis, we didn't considering like procedure justice or recognition, like whether you recognize there is a problem. So now let's back to the challenges of studying intra-urban social inequity in energy interventions. First is always data. We lack fine spatial scale data from utility. And as alternative, scholars have been using national energy consumption surveys such as REX, but this type of survey has very limited coverage. So it's surprisingly for me, even for me to find out in the last round of REX, they only collected 6,000 responses across the US. So you imagine that if you're using this data to model street block level energy use, there will be high uncertainty. And in addition to these energy use data, we also need energy sector investment data, because that gets you to know how the resource like investment is allocated. And this is about the data challenge. And then the second challenge is about analysis disparity by race and income, or technical, or what I really want to say is by race and beyond the income impact. So previously there are studies looking at income disparity in energy use, but using data from utilities, but they haven't looking at what the racial differences are. And then there are studies focusing on looking at the energy use differences by race, but the data modeled. And why I emphasize here is because a lot of the time in the US context, if you talk about, oh, there is racial differences, people will talk about it might be because of income. And then really unpack these two intertwined factors is quite important, because then some people will use the claim, oh, you are emphasize the racial differences, you are the person being racism because you always focus on race. So there are some discussions about that. And then as a scholar, how to help to understand these phenomena is quite important, because we also need method, which I will show in the next several slides. So then the next is, there is an unknown impact of spatial scale of data aggregation, even if we get the data from utility, because several utilities, they have recently started to provide data to public. But because of their data privacy rules, the data aggregate at the level that each utility is comfortable with. And different utility may choose different spatial scale aggregation. Some utilities like California, they have zip code level. And some in St. Paul, Minnesota cities can get a census tract level data. So they get the data, they can analyzing it, but then they don't know the aggregating data, what impact of aggregating data have on the inequality matrix. And then last, after getting the data, when they begin to analyzing the data, there is different energy use metrics that can be used, and then what type of analysis procedures that cities can use to understanding energy use inequality, and also informing social equity in investment. So several examples about the metrics is different metrics, they actually reflect in different, they are controlled or influenced by different things. So energy use per household, it is influenced by floor areas, which is closely related to income. So that may be good to know the income impact. And then energy use intensity by floor areas, they sometimes use the gross metrics for energy use efficiency, but it couldn't tell you whether a poor homes that can sacrifice thermal comfort, or some certain social demographic groups, they have larger household size. And then there is also energy use intensity per capita that can control the housing occupancy, but couldn't get to the thermal comfort issue as well. So there are different metrics. What we did is we actually evaluate all of these metrics. And because of the time, today's result will be showing using energy use intensity as a focus, because the intervention, what I'm looking at is energy efficiency intervention. So, these are the challenges that we're facing. So first we have to get the data, and we obtained a unique fine spatial scale data working with utilities in 2 cities under non-disclosure agreement. This project takes such a long time is because it takes a long time to get these non-disclosure agreements done. And the 2 cities are Tallahassee, which we be able to get premise level energy use data and energy efficiency investment data, covering 90,000 households, so almost all households in the city. And then the second city is St. Paul. We get census block level data, and also the number of households participate in different energy efficiency rebate program that are covering 100,000 households. And then these energy use data, they are monthly. So we later on be able to kind of take a look at annual versus temperature sensitive energy use intensity. So the three questions that I'm trying to get is how much is the difference in energy use intensity across different socioeconomic groups by race and income? And the second is how does the spatial scale of data aggregation influence the social inequality measures of energy use metrics? And then third is looking at investment in energy efficiency and conservation, whether the investment helped to achieve triple goal. Here are community-wide carbon mitigation, addressing energy affordability, and reducing social inequality in energy use. So let's look at the differences in energy use intensity by income and by race. But before that, before looking at energy use, what I find really kind of shocking is to see these structural income and the race pattern. And here in the x-axis, what you're seeing is the percent of racial minority, and the y-axis is the median household income of block groups. Because block groups is the spatial scale that I can get income data. And the different colors, I stratified these block groups based on low income, like the bottom 20% income level, which is the red ones. And then you can see until the blue dots are the block groups that are with the highest income in the highest income quintile. And what the finding is, the block groups in the lowest income quintile have a percentage of racial minority ranging from like 18 to 95%. So it's quite racially diverse in these income stratum. And then when you go to the higher income stratum, block groups in the highest income quintile are majority white. So it is really quite I think some people may not surprise, but it is surprising for me to see this. And then these patterns actually transfer to the energy use, because what we're seeing here is a racial effect beyond income. So the plot here, the x-axis is percent of racial minority, the y-axis is energy use intensity, and the color scheme is still different income strata. And what we're seeing here is the racial structure, like the percentage of racial minority here, have a significant impact on energy use intensity in the lower income strata, but not the highest income stratum. So that means this impact is significant, means within the same income level, and if place have more racial minorities, that influence the energy use intensity. So this is a racial effect beyond income impact. And then how much the impact, how much of the differences are. Here I looking at the disparity in two ways. First is looking at the energy use disparity by income, to looking at the differences across income level. And then the second is focusing on the racial structure within the lowest income stratum. So looking at annual EUI, what we're seeing here in this table is this column is average EUI in the block groups within the lowest income quintile. And then this is the average EUI of block group, average EUI in block groups with the highest income quintile, in the highest income quintile. And then the disparity ratio here, these are all like this symbol here demonstrate the differences between these two groups are significant. And what we're seeing here is in St. Paul and Tallahassee, electricity use in lowest income quintile is 27% higher than the electricity use intensity of the highest income quintile. And in Tallahassee, these differences is 66%. These findings aligning with previous studies find out it is 25% differences. And so like this is kind of somewhat expected. And then when we're looking at energy use disparity by race within the lowest income quintile, we observed that the race can have additional 40% impact. That means block groups within the lowest income that have highest percentage of non-white, they can have up to 40% higher electricity use intensity comparing to the blood groups within the lowest income quintile, but with less non-white population. So this is the way that we think can help us to understand the racial impact beyond income. And then the second analysis is separating temperature sensitive EUI, which we find out it actually unmasks larger disparity. So similar way that we analyzing the annual EUI here, calculating the disparity ratio by income, and then the electricity disparity can be up to 167% larger. That is much larger than what we'll be seeing if we're looking at annual energy use intensity. And if we're looking at the disparity ratio by race within the lowest stratum, what we're seeing here is in Tallahassee, these race impact within the lowest income can be up to 156% larger. So these percentages is much larger than previously what we're seeing, and then is actually quite important to looking at these temperature sensitive, because in Tallahassee, summer is quite hot. You need a lot of cooling, and then in St. Paul, the winter is quite cold. You also need a lot of heating. So it's very important to understand the temperature sensitive EUI in addition to annual ones. So these analysis tells you how we can unpack racial impact beyond income. And then when we analyzing energy use, we are not only looking at annual one, but also looking at temperature sensitive ones. So that conclude how much the difference is by race and income. And then as you notice, the previous analysis was done at the blood group level, because that is the level that I get the income data. And then the second question that I was trying to address to explore is spatial scale of data aggregation. So what I did is I can calculate the Gini coefficient because across three spatial scale, because I have the data at the final census block group level. And then I can calculate how much of Gini coefficient is at the census block level. And then I aggregate to the block groups level, and then to aggregate to the census tract level. And I did these analysis across multiple energy use, like EUI, energy use per household. I have the household income as a comparison. And these gets, what I find is there the Gini coefficient decreases as much as 50% when data aggregate from final to coastal census tract scale. And the interquantile disparity ratio are less sensitive to spatial scale aggregation. And here the energy disparity ratio by race is ranging from -19 to 22, still quite a lot in terms of aggregation, but the change is not like one direction. And then the disparity ratio by income is -20 to 10 when we aggregate from block group to census tract level. So I have 2 minutes, so I have to move really fast to get to the, I have 1 minute to get to the last question, whether the investment in energy efficiency and conservation, addressing community-wide mitigation, affordability, and social inequality in focusing on the low-income racial minorities. So here the quantile analysis, I separated block groups into 4 quantile, and when we're looking at community-wide carbon mitigation, we have to looking at block groups have larger homes and larger energy intensity. So here, this is the participation. The different color means the participation, and the red is high participation. These purple color is low participation. And what we see in these quadrants, that participation is good. The energy share is kind of proportional to the investment share is proportional to energy share. So what we find here is the energy efficiency investment has focused on addressing community-wide carbon mitigation. So this is also what we find in Tallahassee. And then in terms of addressing energy burden, here the quadrant is divided based on energy bill and also the household income level, and the same participation level we analyze it. And then the quadrant that we focus on is the quadrant with high energy and low income. And it's not the best participation, but it is also not the worst. And then there is the proportion, less proportion, investment proportion is lower, but not terribly to population. And then that gets to the current investment has focused on addressing energy affordability. And then last is whether whether the investment has focusing on the low income and more racial minorities. What we can see, this is really much lower participation, and the investment is much lower than the investment share is much lower than the population share. So what we have here is that energy sector investment actually hasn't focused too much on those low income racial minority block groups. And that there is a reason, because here, especially the block groups in green shows that should be prioritized for community-wide carbon mitigation. And then the blue are the block groups that should be focused on addressing energy burden. So you can see there is little overlap. And then same thing here, when we overlap with the block groups with more low-income racial minorities, so there is also little overlap. So I think this just gets us that cities may need two separate programs to address both issues. And then that gets to the conclusion about the importance of using fine spatial scale data from utility. And then when we get the data, we have to be aware of the data, at which level the data is aggregated. And then we have a new method to do social inequality in energy intervention. And that concludes my talk today. And I think I might be over.
Thank you, KK. It was so interesting. And I really like how you were able to kind of take the two different cities and then look at the different set of metrics. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it looks like the paper was just published, so we can learn more about it. So I also have the honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Harold Rickenbacker, and Harold works at the Environmental Defense Fund. And in full disclosure, I got to work with him for several years. So it's really great to see him again. And Harold's going to be talking to us about environmental justice, specifically air pollution, health, and equity. And I think he's going to be able to pull some of these concepts that we were talking about together. So without further ado, Harold.
Thanks for that introduction. Can everyone hear me fine and see my screen?
Yes, thank you, Harold.
Perfect. And we're dealing with some actual tropical storms here in the Southeast. So bandwidth, I'm going to stay off video, but I'll join us a bit later for the Q&A if that works for the group. But currently, I work at the Environmental Defense Fund based in Washington, D.C. A little bit about EDF. We've been around for 52 years. Actually, it's a nonprofit organization. So hopefully I can bring together, as Melissa alluded to, some of the concepts moving kind of from data to action in this kind of practitioner, with this practitioner lens. But we tend to focus on climate, energy, ecosystems, health, and oceans in this work. And even more specifically, I work for what's called EDF Plus Business, where we find solutions to benefit both the environment and the economy. I'd like to mention that, we partner with many high impact companies, some of which are listed on the screen here. But I'd like to note again, we are a nonprofit and we don't take any money from businesses to collaborate. So similar to academics, rely solely on grants and other donations. And we like to say we get paid in environmental results. But today I'll actually be talking about my work on what's called EDF's Global Clean Air Initiatives. We have on-the-ground projects in 7 countries. So that's the US, UK, China, Mexico, India, Indonesia, and Ethiopia, where we are deploying new technology to pinpoint pollution at, again, a hyper-local scale. Some quick data background, around the world, 9 out of 10 people breathe unhealthy air. Air pollution is recognized as the largest or biggest environmental risk for early death and is responsible for 5 million premature deaths each year from heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, and other non-communicable diseases. But while most conventional monitoring networks or systems provide this general picture of a city's air quality, it doesn't account for pollution at the census tract level or block level and really reflect a person's inhalation dose or lived experience. So to that point, again, we are developing or filling in gaps where there's modeled data and really investigating or painting this more holistic picture of air pollution sources and impacts. We, for some of our work with methane satellite, air pollution monitoring on mobile platforms such as drones and Google Earth Street View cars. Then I'll briefly walk through in some of the slides one of those case studies and then talk about implications for transportation equity in this work. As this audience knows, I don't feel like I have to drill home this message, but human causes of global warming, right? Agricultural practices. But today I'd like to really talk about transportation based on its past and present kind of growth trajectory. Transportation is responsible for 15% of today's global greenhouse gas emissions, and that number is expected to continue to grow and be the largest source of emissions into 2050. In fact, 80% of that growth will be coming directly from freight, right? So that's aviation, medium heavy-duty vehicles, ships, you name it. And those health impacts from transportation, although include all transportation, so that's passenger vehicles, aviation, but more specifically, emissions impacts from medium heavy duty trucks are rising quite rapidly. You'll see in the figure here, back in 2015, medium heavy duty vehicles, so those are like your class 8 trucks and lower, made up 90% of total vehicle population, but accounted for 39% of all transportation emissions. This number is projected, or medium heavy duty vehicles are projected to account for nearly 60% of new emissions and rival passenger cars as the largest source of transportation emissions going into 2050. So again, drilling home the message that diesel emissions, medium heavy duty trucks are really growing rapidly and will have impacts on global warming. But why is it more important now than ever? Well, the demand for shipping services is expected to grow significantly. That's due to emerging industry trends, such as the rise in same-day delivery. Everyone on the call who has Amazon Prime, maybe just take a second to reflect. I won't ask you to raise your hand, but there's a growing need for kind of this last mile service. This picture is actually the Inland Empire in California, where you see there's a residential homes literally nestled in between fulfillment centers and other warehouse facilities. And the impacts are felt by the communities that live adjacent to, again, some of these truck tracking businesses. Walmart's e-commerce sales has increased by 97% in the pandemic. Amazon's transportation emissions, or excuse me, I should say transportation near fulfillment centers has doubled since the pandemic. So again, now we're seeing on top of the rise in same-day shipping, the pandemic or syndemic, we've seen a disproportionate impact on communities of color as it relates to transportation emissions, increase in GHG, congestion, and local air pollution. So quickly, beyond what's in the literature, I'd like to walk through some of EDF's own investigations. More specifically, I'd like to highlight a case study in West Oakland, California. For those of you who are not familiar with California or work in the U.S., this community is enclosed by 3 major freeways. You can see that outlined here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the image on the left. It's also downwind of the Port of Oakland, which is the 8th busiest counterport in the United States and experiences high truck volumes, as well as, again, many industrial facilities nestled amongst residential homes. In 2015, we began a project to map street-level air pollution in neighborhoods in West Oakland, in areas currently serviced by just one single regulatory monitor. For context, in the urban U.S., where there's about 60% population that is again serviced by regulatory monitors, there's only about 2 to 5 per 1 million people. Again, so very sparse networks, and really zooming in on the power of this hyperlocal insight. So we partnered with the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, which is a community-based organization. So getting to some of the social equity points mentioned in the previous presentation, Google Earth Outreach, Alclima, and other academic researchers, University of Texas at Austin, and collected street-level data on black carbon and NOx using fast response sensors on the vehicles. Knowing where the pollution is coming from, obviously, is a key outcome for action, right? So really getting to the data to action piece in this work itself. The resulting maps demonstrate a high degree of inter-neighborhood variability in air pollution. where within West Oakland on individual streets, we saw areas that were 5 to 8 times higher than the median pollution levels or concentrations. We followed that study with epidemiological assessment alongside Kaiser Permanente Division of Research, where we collected medical records for 41,000 people insured by Kaiser Permanente Health and linked air pollution at the home address, again, with health records. That data demonstrated that elderly residents, so those are individuals that 65 age or older, were exposed to higher levels of nitrogen dioxide and black carbon in the immediate vicinity of their home. And it was equivalent actually to a history of smoking. Again, a 40% greater risk of cardiovascular disease event than those in less polluted areas of the actual neighborhood. Moreover, we collected transportation-related air pollution data, so black carbon and NOx on 2 freeways in the Bay Area. So that's I-880, which is in the red in this figure, which is a designated truck route, and Interstate 580 in that same city where trucks are prohibited. And the data showed that concentrations of black carbon along I-880 were roughly 60% higher than the average concentrations on Interstate 580. Similarly, for nitrogen dioxide, nearly 50% higher. In conclusion, on this case study, we worked with the community-based organization to inform the Port of Oakland's plan to transition to zero-emission seaport and help verify some of the city's truck management plan. Also, this West Oakland community was one of the first Bay Area communities to receive or develop a community air plan under California's new air quality management legislation, AB 6117, which calls for emission and exposure reductions in communities impacted by air pollution. So again, getting to the data to action piece. Again, I'm leaning more now to speak more on the EJ implications, as my title alluded to. So hopefully I made the case for why transportation pollution matters for health. But now again, want to zoom in on linkages to air, EJ and equity. You often hear in the public health space that your zip code is the most important social determinant factor of your health alongside race. And due to decades of residential segregation, people of color tend to live where there's greater exposure to pollution, right? This data shows that African Americans are 75% more likely to live in fence line communities. Those not in this space, fence line communities are essentially communities that are next to companies, industries, or service facilities are impacted or affected by the facility's operation. So that could be noise pollution, that we heard about in our first presentation, odor, traffic, and other chemical emissions. But one unique piece is a lot of people don't realize, and this is some of the work that I did alongside Dr. Billick at the University of Pittsburgh, that many environmental hazards like air pollution can exacerbate pre-existing health conditions. Factors like socioeconomic status and social behavioral factors contribute to increased susceptibility, where you have this cumulative burden or compounding impact on communities of color and low-income communities. So again, not only are they worrying about environmental factors, but you have these socioeconomic variables that have a cumulative burden on their overall quality of life and health. So exposure to episodic chronic life stresses in your adulthood essentially has an impact with the severity of chronic diseases across your lifespan. With that, now I'd like to introduce, and I'm at 11 minutes, so I'm doing pretty good on time. But now I'd like to introduce a project and define how we're approaching this work from a transportation equity lens through some work in New York, New Jersey, and the DMV region, as well as Delaware. I talked about the Oakland case study and defined it as a port community, but in EJ community, you also hear the term dry ports, or these are more inland facilities such as warehouses, distribution centers, and fulfillment centers that are disproportionately concentrated in low-income communities. As a result, air pollution, including emissions from diesel trucks, are felt and highly concentrated in some of these same communities. More recently, you've seen a push from frontline groups targeting warehouses from some of our known household names around e-commerce and the impact that it's had on health. So we decided to do an investigation in the continental U.S. that looks at structure tracking businesses and warehouses in the U.S. and the impact it has on surrounding communities. So this sample is for about 13,000 warehouses The caveat here is it's not an exhaustive or complete data set, or we're not aware of any public data sets. So we use standard industrial classification and NAT codes to cross-reference warehouses from the Data Axle repository. And that's how we got to this data in partnership with some of our colleagues at MIT. We've done what we're calling proximity mapping analysis in New York, New Jersey, some regions in Texas and California. But right now I want to zoom in rural North Carolina, which is actually not far from where I'm from. So it's maybe some personal reason here to include it on today's presentation. But not to jump ahead, but I wanted to share this kind of concluding figure to make or put some pretext of what it means for this audience. So what we'll be doing is developing these different warehouse clusters in residential communities across the US and calculating the socioeconomic demographic variables around those facilities. So again, truck attracting businesses, impacts of emissions from tailpipes as well as noise pollution, congestion, you name it, and how that has an impact on the communities that live within these warehouses or near these warehouses. So those who are familiar with ArcGIS, we did a half-mile radius or half-mile buffer around the facilities. And this is a quick example in North Carolina where we saw 4,500 people live within a half-mile radius of a warehouse cluster. 97% were people of color. The adult asthma prevalence was 12%. And for context, in the 500 cities health data from the CDC, that average in North Carolina is 7%. Similar data for COPD, stroke prevalence, and pulmonary heart disease. Again, social infrastructure on the figure on the left, you'll see is in close proximity to a lot of these facilities. So baseball field, homeless shelter, a university, a high school. Again, how are these communities being impacted by some of the implications for truck attracting businesses? Again, what does this mean for this audience? As community members first, before you're academics, you have the power to influence. Plus, business will work closely with corporations, many local government officials to influence public policies around topics like faster utility make-ready infrastructure, even advancing research around environmental life cycle impacts of batteries. You heard that in the previous presentation, but also coordinating with utility companies, right? So identifying target pilot locations for electric service plans and grid capacity that would meet the needs of commercial EVs and commercial medium heavy duty EVs, and prioritizing those in the communities that are impacted by tailpipe emissions first. So briefly just walk through my methodologies and some of the data sources to say that this is publicly available data. We use the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. It has like 4 composite scores or 4 scores that comes up with the summation of a composite score, and it looks at things like socioeconomic status, so percent below poverty, household composition, so the age of the residents in the home, minority status, you name it. Also, the CDC, the places data a few years back, and it's been updated since, but it is 500 cities and local health data for things like asthma, COPD here in the US. I mentioned working on Plus Business, so we have partnerships with many logistic partners, so warehouse facilities, e-commerce companies, city managers, you name it, where we're actually able to access some of that private data. So now we're talking about vehicle class information, average daily traffic count, vehicle types, actual entrance and exit routes, and where the vehicles are parking at the end of the day. So there's so much that can go into some of these proximity mapping case studies, and actually be interested to work with any of the colleagues here on the phone to develop some of that policy advocacy and data to action pathways and case studies in cities across the globe. So again, a prelude to some of the work that's happening right now. As far as the methods, we're using ArcGIS, inputting localized data for point emissions, again, leaning on that warehouse assessment data set, doing the area apportionment method to identify within a half-mile radius the actual demographic and health estimates in this region. And again, leaning on those census estimates to extrapolate the sample of the population within that half-mile radius of each facility. It's important to be clear, some of the limitations, while the method the method for understanding population is under peer review and we're highly confident in it, the underlying data for warehouses is not exhaustive. So again, working closely with local municipalities and doing these individual case studies based on business registries in your specific city is the best case scenario. So walking through that North Carolina case study, we often like to start really high level I was on a call about 2 weeks back with about 50 local legislators, health department personnel, and policymakers in North Carolina, presenting this as a case study in developing health recommendations based on the data. So briefly here, just looking at the county level, we looked at asthma incidents and asthma prevalence in North Carolina. Now overlaying that data with the warehouse health records and health records. And one thing that I would like to say here as I'm leaning in on the next slide is we're not claiming causality. We've done the health impact assessment in West Oakland you saw in the prior work, but aren't quite there yet on the air pollution monitoring work associated with the transportation and warehouse facilities in this specific case study. We have colleagues that are working on source apportionment projects in Salt Lake City and back trajectory models that will inform this work. But again, even just using the eye test here, you can generally see we're looking at where the warehouses are, where the higher asthma prevalence is, and where average annual daily truck traffic is, again, impacts air pollution or impacts truck traffic within North Carolina itself. Now zooming in on actual census tracts, so looking at the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, and the number closer to 1 means more vulnerable. We'll see here within a half-mile radius around the facility, this is where we teased out specific census tracts for the most social vulnerability regions in North Carolina. And now looking at population density around those same warehouses. Now you have population density plus high social vulnerability, and now we teased out these red areas where we're calling very high burden warehouses, where again, population density matches where there's high social vulnerability around those facilities. I'll zoom in really quickly, but in conclusion, we found about 153 very high impact warehouses that were in the top 20%, and 127,000 people living within just 1/2 mile radius of those impacted warehouses. Similar to the earlier example I showed, 90% of people of color within this 1/2 mile radius, 2 times more likely to have asthma, close to 1 social vulnerability index, and a lot of social infrastructure. So we have North Carolina A&T State University, historically black college and university in this region, residential area, grocery store, you name it. And again, a lot of social infrastructure within that 1/2 mile radius. I know a lot of data folks on the call, so say that you weren't cherry picking and showing this North Carolina case study, but we initially saw these health concerns replicated nationally, where close to 60% of people of color live within a 1/2 mile radius of those 13,000 warehouses. You see about 14 million people live, or total population around those facilities. Similar data around asthma prevalence, CHD, COPD, and stroke to make the case for, again, where we electrify fleet. And that's kind of my concluding piece here. I don't have to drill the message home why we should invest in zero emission. I don't like saying zero emission. So electric vehicles, net benefits in disadvantaged communities, local air quality improvements, cheaper cost of ownership, federal fuel economy standards are on the horizon. So getting ahead of the curve in that sense. But the grid is also evolving, which will truly benefit electric vehicles. But we've used this work again with corporations and policy makers to say, based on health and equity data, prioritize where things like funding voucher programs, green collar jobs, fast charging infrastructure, air pollution monitoring networks, you name it, make the case for where they should take precedence, right? Not in the most affluent communities, but from an equity lens, starting where there's a disproportionate burden and prioritizing that for the work moving forward. My last slide here, I'm right at 20 minutes, so I want to make sure I'm conscious of time. We've seen kind of the Biden-Harris administration kickstart, the adoption of zero emission vehicles and some of their proposed fundings, our $2 trillion climate plan, and 40% of those benefits are supposed to be dedicated to frontline communities, which is significant. But on the corporate side, there's tons of organizations that are making these commitments and actions as well, and most of them that we are working with. And I'd be more than willing to speak more detailedly on a side note to any universities or academics on the call who would love to partner on a similar project. Thank you for your time. Any questions I can entertain in the chat. And again, thanks for being inviting me to today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Harold. And it's just so great to see how much work you've done in such a short period of time since you graduated. And as Harold mentioned, he'll take some questions in the chat. And we're going to move on to our last presenter.
Our last presenter is Mohammed, and he is a senior scientist of climate risk and resilience. And he's going to be talking to us today about resilient urban systems in the face of looming uncertainties. So, are you there?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much. And again, beautiful slides. I love all these colors.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's 4:30 a.m. in Hong Kong.
I know. Thank you for being here.
Okay, so thank you for the opportunity. And I will present on one of our projects, which is on resilient urban systems in the face of looming uncertainties. And looming uncertainties here refer to different climate aspects or natural hazards. Okay, so it's working, right?
Yes, it's working. Thank you.
Okay. As we all know that cities are bearing most of the impacts from climate change, and this call for scientists to provide different solutions and different tools. And then there has been a recent debate on building resilient urban systems to both type of shocks like acute and chronic. And like we have been working in this field from last 6 to 7 years, and we have found that there are so many limitations in current reductionist tools and approaches or frameworks which are available. Therefore, there is an urgent need to update the tools and frameworks so that we can have better resilience management in terms of building resilience monitoring and enhancement. So when we talk about the urban setting, if we just look at this urban area, we can see that there are different type of spreads within the city. So for example, it could be a horizontal spread where the cities are just spread out horizontally. It could be an infill development, or it could be a vertical area. And this gives us two type of urban areas. So one is less dense, and the horizontal one, and the other one is high density. So in USA, for example, in New Jersey or areas around that, where you see most of the communities or most of the cities around spread at a horizontal scale. However, in Hong Kong, the vertical development is more often to be seen, and that is why it becomes more challenging to provide solution to different type of problems, especially when it comes to building resilience. So in our recent study, we provided a comprehensive typhoon risk assessment along the Chinese coast, and we found out that this Guangdong region where Hong Kong lies is one of the highest risk regions. So we decided to work in Hong Kong at building level so that we can provide a comprehensive framework to assess the resilience, to manage it, and to communicate the result to different stakeholders and policymakers for decision making or resource allocation. And this is the overall layout, just a brief layout, and then in a bit I will explain each component. So we took systems of system fashion, and then collected the data on different economic, social, and spatial environmental aspects within a city, and then used a geodatabase and some spatial modeling approaches to profile the disaster resilience of a city. However, this city resilience is not in terms of horizontal stuff, but it accounts for the vertical spread or the vertical development of the cities. So we start with the sub-indices or subsystems refinement, and we came up based on the literature review with economic component, social component, and spatial environmental component. And based on these different components or subsystems, we customized indicator list, and we collected the building level data on all these indicators, and then we normalized it from 0 to 1 and use the geodatabase to compute a resilience index, and then did some analysis and resilience profiling. So for this resilience analysis, we use two different types of analysis: statistical analysis, which is based on the summary statistics or ANOVA and scoring tables production, whereas the spatial analysis is based on global Moran-I or local indicators and some machine learning based clustering. So this framework is actually applied to a small area in Hong Kong. It is known as Sha Tin, and we collected the data on 212 different buildings, and each building is actually regarded as a community due to the number of residents ranging between like 3,000 to 10,000 within some buildings. And the score here is from 0 to 2, and the larger the score, the higher the resilience, and the lower the score, the lower the resilience. Then this one is just a general distribution. So to dig more deep into this one, we applied a spatial statistical model-based hotspot identification. And here you will see all the hotspots and cold spots. So hotspots are where the resilience is low, and the cold spots are where the resilience is high. So we are more concerned with these red buildings, and it accounts within different domains or different subsystems of the disaster resilience. Like the economic one is 4%, and from the social one is 3%, from spatial environmental is 16%, and then from overall is 10%. So it means if we talk about overall resilience, there are 10% of the buildings within this community or within this area which are identified as a statistically significant low cluster of low resilience. And these type of identification help us to prioritize these buildings or these communities. And to further go on and identify that how or what could be the factors behind this low resilience or high resilience, we applied a machine learning based multivariate grouping analysis, and it helped us dividing the data set or the buildings into 4 different groups. And these are just as per the overall resilience, these are the lowest resilience, the low resilience, then intermediate, and the highest resilience. So we can see that the buildings in red color in the map. So it can be seen that if the overall resilience is lower, their spatial environmental status is somehow okay, even it is below average. But the most critical aspects are the social aspects and economic aspects. And similarly, the second most critical group is this orange one, where we can see that the spatial environmental conditions are not as good as it should be. So using the building level information, we computed this index on the administrative level to scale up to different administrative levels, because most of the legislation and policy making or decision making happens at this level. So we just color coded it, and the results are presented in terms of one standard deviation. So this helps us identify different regions or different council boundaries which are highly resilient or less resilient in terms of economic resilience, social, spatial, environmental, and overall resilience. And all of this information is uploaded to an online database, and this is created using ArcGIS online dashboards. So each of this contains all the aspects of resilience, like economic, social, spatial, environmental, and overall. And just clicking it gives us all the information, and all these, both of these scales are provided so that people can differentiate between the buildings and the UAC level or the district level. And the scaled resilience can also be used to compute, to further compute the risk assessment, because based on this recent study from our group, so the risk is, it can be regarded as a combination or as a function of hazard, vulnerability, and resilience. However, this resilience information was not integrated or available for this risk assessment aspects. So once we have this, we can calculate the risk, and we can we can move toward the informed risk management and also the resilience enhancement frameworks, and then we can work on the mitigation and adaptation, which is both, I mean, particularly important to sustainability and achieving sustainable development goals under climate variability. So in the concluding remarks, I will just highlight the aspects of the STEP framework which we propose. So it is proposed for the high density cities, keeping in the mind that the built environment in high density regions is not as it is in the less dense cities or the sparse cities. And it takes into the spatial, environmental, social, and economic factor. In the previous one, the spatial environmental factors are mostly not accounted for. So this is one of the improvement in the STEP framework. Then using the STEP enables us to identify the priority intervention areas, and it can be used for the spatial segregation or spatial clustering or spatial prioritization of different areas on each other. Then an interactive platform is built which acts as a resilience knowledge base to help practitioners and decision makers in monitoring and management. So there is also a limitation at this point, which is that only one single time step is evaluated for this research. However, we have built this online platform or interactive platform in a way that if the data is available on the temporal aspects or temporal scales, then just inputting the data will automatically calculate all the indices and we will have an update. So this can be used for to keep a track of all the changes with respect to time and space both. Then it serves as a data-driven decision support system for resource allocation, because we know that if there are some areas or some communities where the resilience score is low in terms of economic resilience or other aspects of resilience, then those areas or communities need to be prioritized. So this can be guided, or this can be done in a more effective way using such information. Then lastly, the framework provide more reliable and robust information for upper level analysis. For example, if we want to move from the building level analysis to district level and from district level to city level analysis, then it is, though there will be some kind of uncertainty due to the scale application or scale aggregation, but it will be more reliable as compared to getting the data on city level or district level and then using that one. So there are different type of initiatives and you can say adaptation initiatives ranging from immediate to long term. And we are mostly working on community resilience adaptation, which is near term to medium term. So we are currently covering this immediate, near term and medium term analysis, also risk assessments, data collection and modeling and mapping. However, we also try to move from medium to long-term analysis. So to do that one at Intensive Climate Risk Solution Provider, we are working on data modeling and calculation, and we are running the weather models and also getting the satellite observations from different sources and combining it using the AI models and machine learning algorithms. And then we have developed SaaS, software as a system, and this platform is a subscription-based platform, and this is providing the enhanced dynamic AI-based climate analytics, and also it is helping to map the exposure, vulnerability, resilience, and risk at asset level. So the overall aim is to provide the risk solutions at asset level, i.e. different insurance companies or asset managers or banks or something like that. And a number of climate and risk related analytics are included into this one. So it can be compared to each other, or it can help us quantify the dollar losses for each aspect, or sorry, each asset under different climate scenarios as presented by IPCC. And that's all, because I was told that the time is very short, so I just kept it small.
Yeah.
So if you have any question, I think we can just go on.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And I know it's a really rough hour for you. So thank you for being with us. And what I'd like to ask you to do, if you could stop sharing your screen. We have about 7 minutes for Q&A. And what I'm going to try to do is to pin our speakers and see if that helps. And the first question, and Sheila, maybe you can ask the first question that you posted while I'm pinning.
Yeah, sure. So my question was for Harold. So thank you for the interesting presentation. I was wondering about the overall transportation sector's footprint. So you mentioned that during COVID, the footprint of shipping due to like online shopping, you gave the example of Amazon, has been increased. But I was wondering if you can comment on the general state of the emissions related with transportation sector, because people were working from home and personal or public transportation was drastically reduced. So I was wondering if you have such kind of statistics just to comment on.
Sure, thanks for that question. I'll say this, there's been tons of work, more specifically, I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of the images from NASA that has shown reductions in pollution associated with, fossil fuel use, whether that's, specifically emitted to or attributed to tailpipe emissions from cars or smokestacks from generating electricity itself. So generally, via lockdown and less commuting, work from home environment, we have seen, and in a lot of our work, or at least in some of our key areas like London and elsewhere, that there has been reductions in these kind of intercity and urban air pollution, the airshed or background pollution. But we have worked with and heard kind of anecdotally from some of our business partners that a lot of their transportation fleet, as a result of e-commerce increasing, has had an impact on transportation near those fulfillment centers, distribution centers, and warehouses. To be interested, we are in the process of actually doing some more fence line monitoring around those facilities, have collected kind of these baseline data, relying solely on kind of the regulatory network from the local health departments, but are doing a study to really investigate kind of that pre-post pandemic numbers within the actual vicinity of the warehouses and locations. So I don't want to, speak prematurely, but hopefully I'll have some, concrete data to speak to that, to the impact. The last point I'll add is we have seen in actual truck counting studies, working with frontline groups, and data that has shown an influx and increase in the transportation emissions, transportation vehicles themselves, but just don't have the source apportionment models and the air pollution data to back that.
Thank you, Harold. And I think Philip wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I was just backing that up. Our data showed that NOx emissions, the NOx values we were reading in the city centre were about 35% less than normal during lockdown. I think the interesting thing is that the recovery periods saw us rapidly climb back up to 95%, and now traffic is higher than pre-lockdown, simply because public transport, trust in public transport because of transmission and various other things, and government advice not to use public transport, which has carried on, means that our traffic levels are now higher than pre-lockdown. So whilst there's been some benefits from it in terms of, working from home and those sorts of things, there's also been negative benefits. The other point is what was really interesting, and particularly focusing on the complex nature of air quality. Although our NOx reductions were down during lockdown, certainly during the first lockdown, April, May, June in 2020, our particulate matter went through the roof and was really high. And that was because We had a climatic conditions in the UK where we had a wind coming from the south up north. So we had a huge amount of regional transport of PM2.5. So it just demonstrates that, you can, everything's interconnected, and you can't just think about one city. You can't even think about one country. Well, you might be able to in the US, but certainly not in the UK. You can't think about one country. You have to think about this as a regional problem.
Did either of the two panelists want to comment on that as well? Are you okay? Okay, I did. Okay, go ahead, KK.
Oh no, I have just tried just to say Harold's answer just also addressed my question in terms of the air pollution due to where the warehouses versus the commuting decreases. I think I'm looking forward to Harold's analysis coming out.
Me too.
Can I ask
Oliver, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. I wondered if we can go back a little bit to, you have all presented some great stuff you have done, but where should we go from here? So what do you think, where should the SUS section should lay its focus of in the research area? Thank you, Melissa.
I can go first in terms of large-scale analysis, looking at city not only as one quote-unquote black box. And what I presented is looking really go to finer spatial scale. But then what I haven't said today is we can also looking at cities to national level, but then the outcome will be different. The reason why I presented today the results on social inequality, social equity is because for cities, those impact will be local. So then that means you need more final spatial scale analysis. But then when we're looking at, for say, climate change impact, then the scale has to be cities linked to the national, to the regional impact, and also the air pollution that Philip just bringing up. Those type of transboundary issues are associated with urban activities, then we need to really zoom out to looking at higher spatial analysis, how link cities to national, to regional level scales, like focusing for different outcome, we have to think about different spatial scale. That's, I think, what should go forward is scale consideration, multiple impact of urban activities.
Perfect. Anyone else?
I must confess I'm speaking from a complete point of ignorance, but I think none of these issues are solved or even contemplated successfully without the inclusion of social and behavioral scientists. And if you think of this as a technical problem, then you are certainly missing at least 50% of the picture, not just more. So I think the sort of thrust of things has to be, bringing in these multidisciplinary teams, which are really hard to do, across science, engineering, the social science, the medical sciences, even culture and the arts, in terms of getting that message across. And I think that's where we might make some really interesting strides forwards. But you may already be doing that, because I'm speaking from a point of ignorance, and I apologize.
Oh, that's great. Okay, we are already 2 minutes over. I would just I was taking notes, and to me, and I just put it in the chat, what I saw was really this need for integration. And I think, Philip, you started to talk about that actually at the beginning part of the chat, where when you have such disparate data sets without context, it's, the integration is truly key. And then I think moving into more discussions on equity, and also thinking about how we can also employ circular economy strategies to make sure that we have an inclusive economy, I think is really important. And then KK and Harold, I think you all also really illuminated the need to think about different metrics across scales and how that works in different regions. And lastly, really the visualizations that we ended with were amazing. And I thought it was interesting how Philip started with visualizations, and then we ended with visualizations as well. And I think, that power of that message, I think, is also very important.
And so I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I also want to personally thank the speakers. I know everyone's time is really short, so thank you. And I want to thank my fellow board members for being here and putting up with the 10,000 emails. So thank you so much. All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care.